So we are going live. Just give it a few, I'm going to give it a second to connect, then we will get started. Then we will get started. Great, so we are connected and share my screen. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Systems Change Masterclass Office Hours. This is a very short presentation, and the ideal is to really give you a very foundational, very simple understanding of what systems change is and how to use the 5R tool to identify and create a systems change strategy. At this point, you should have already a personal purpose statement, which is very, very, very important. It may not seem important, but it's very important, A, to understand why you're doing the work that you do. And it becomes really important once we start talking about partnership development. And also it's very important for systems change, just to make sure that the type of systems change you want to see is aligned with your own personal values. So that's very important. If you still haven't done it, I strongly encourage you to do so. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to your country rep or even to myself if you need more support there. Um, Also, what we asked for you all to do before the last webinar was to create your problem statement. Hopefully you all were able to do that as well. The worksheet we shared was very straightforward, but we will use some of our Q&A time today to address any questions you may have about the problem statement. Of course, the Q&A will also be used for the system, any questions you may have about system change. And then we would do breakout groups which will also focus on the problem statement as well as you all getting to know each other. So what I've just described here is pretty much what our agenda is for today. I'm going to spend about 30 minutes, probably less than that, on this presentation. We're going to spend about 30 minutes with Q&A. And we're going to spend about 30 minutes in our breakout groups. So again, if you haven't already, please change please rename yourself, adding your language, so that once we create the breakout groups, it'll be a lot easier to make sure that everyone is in the right breakout group. Okay, so without further ado, what is systems change? That's a very important question. And at the very least, you should understand what systems change is. Oh, and before I continue, for our Francophone participants, we have this presentation in French, which we will share with you after the webinar. Sorry, the office hours session. For everyone, we will share the presentation. So, don't worry so much about what's here on my screen. Please just be engaged and listen to the presentation, the audio form of the presentation, and you'll get this presentation as a file after office hours. So what is systems change? Systems change is essentially addressing the root causes of a social problem in an effort to alter the components and structures that cause the system to behave in a certain way, right? So fundamentally, systems change speaks to root causes, and it seeks to change how the system works to produce the outcomes that we don't want to see. So basically, you want to change the structure of the system to produce better outcomes. So every system has at least 4 features. So systems have multiple connected parts, right? These parts work together to produce outcomes that can't be produced alone. Systems have a specific border, and systems are usually a part of a broader system, right? So just think of yourself as a human being. You, as a human being, you are a system, right? You have multiple connected parts. You have, a heart that pumps blood. You have a brain, right? You have limbs. You have a mouth. You have a nose. These are multiple connected parts of the same system. Now, all of these connected parts work together to produce outcomes that can't be produced alone, right? So even me speaking right now is not just a function of my mouth moving, but there are things happening in my brain, right, that are helping me to speak. The specific border of this system, of course, is my body. And speaking of larger systems, right, I am a human being, I am American, so I am a part of a much broader network of other human beings that make up the US. And then even that is a part of a larger global system, right? So that's a very sort of oversimplified example of a system, right? So systems are all around us, and we ourselves, to a certain extent, are systems. Just to give you a very simplified example. Now, let's talk about impact and where system change falls on the scale of impact. So as you can see illustrated on my screen, to the left side of my screen, there's an iceberg, right? So there's a part of the iceberg that's above the water. Then there's a part of the iceberg that's below the water. So what's reflected above the water is what we call symptoms of social issues. So high unemployment would be a symptom of a deeper social issue or a deeper issue, right? Hunger is a symptom. Most of the social challenges you see in the world, you really see them as symptoms of deeper problems. Then you have the root causes, which again is represented below the surface. Now, as far as social impact, there are 3 levels. At the very top level, there is direct service. So a direct service is addressing the immediate needs of a specific individual or community. So again, if you see that there is mass hunger in your community, a direct service would be creating a soup kitchen where you're feeding the hungry, right? That's an example of a direct service. On the next level is scaling direct service. So basically what that means is that, again, you're only addressing the symptoms, using hunger as an example again. Instead of just providing one soup kitchen in this next level, you maybe will open 6 soup kitchens, right? Because that would give you the ability to feed more people. So that's an example of scale direct service. Now, system change is where we seek to address the root causes of a social problem. So, for instance, people may be hungry because there are a lack of jobs, right? And so, what a system change strategy would be to create more employment in the communities that have high hunger. Well, a lot of people who are hungry, so that they will have the income to buy food, right? That's a very oversimplified example, but I'm just keeping it very simple at this point, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And if you have any questions, please note them, and we'll get to Q&A very soon. So this is 3 levels of social impact. Now, this doesn't mean that there's any level that's better than or worse than the other, right? This doesn't speak to hierarchy. Direct service is not better than or worse than system change. It's just to give you a visual idea of the different levels of impact, right? And I'm pretty sure that within your organizations, you're probably working at one or more of these levels. But we'll go through an example of exactly how system change works very shortly. So 5R analysis. So what the 5R analysis, what it attempts to help you do, and what it is a tool to help show you how systems work to produce specific outcomes. And so you all should have received the 5R analysis worksheet. You didn't have to, we want you all to actually attempt to do the worksheet after the office hours. If you've already started to do it, that's okay. But right now, we're going to walk through how the 5R analysis works. And this would be a good place for you to note any questions you may have for the Q&A, because this should be beneficial for you once you attempt to do the 5R analysis. Okay, so let me explain the 5R analysis in a way that's very practical and hopefully helpful for you all. So the 5R analysis, just imagine that you are, let's say you're God, right? And you're looking at the world. So you're not a part of it, but you're sort of looking at it. And you see the world as it is, and you want to analyze the world. That's the way to sort of think of how to use a 5R analysis. So I'm saying that because many social entrepreneurs, when they attempt to do this exercise, they try to analyze the system from the perspective of their organization, right? Sorry, could you all mute yourselves if you aren't muted already? Please mute yourselves. Thank you. So yeah, a lot of people attempt to do the 5R analysis, but they attempt to do it from the perspective of their work. And so what I'm saying is that this has, at least for the sake of exercise, this has nothing to do with your work, at least at the beginning, right? It's really just a tool to help you to understand how a system already works. And so there are 5 components to the 5R analysis that will help you understand how systems work. So every system in this analysis has resources that are put into the system. So that's money, that's people, that's culture. Culture can be a resource. And then physical assets, of course. So you have like land, cars, buildings, etc. And we'll do a very practical example to help you understand what that means. But really, the first step is, or one of the first steps is understanding what resources make up your system. The next category are rules. So these are any laws, policies, but then also culture. You'll see culture come up a lot here, right? There are certain rules that are not necessarily stated explicitly, but they're implicit culture in the culture, right? So that's rules. Then you have roles. So the roles mainly have to do with the actors within the system. So these are any professional roles, any social roles. Title is there because usually these roles speak to hierarchy, as you'll see in the illustration. And then again, culture is always a part that you should think about that may not be as explicit, but you should definitely try to understand what roles are played through any cultural values within a system. And that's everywhere, right? There's always these cultural dynamics that aren't necessarily explicitly stated. So they're not necessarily, very, they're more intuitive. They're not necessarily explicit. Relationships. So what type of relationships exist within the system? Again, a lot of that has to do with hierarchy. A lot of it has to do with culture, But a good way to think about relationships is that relationships are highly influenced by rules and the different roles that exist in the system. That dictates how the different actors relate within the system. And then results. So the results are basically, the way I like to think of it is it really has to do with those symptoms that I talked about in the previous slide, right? So what are the outcomes, right? And you can find one thing that would give you a clue to the results are the different stats around uh, around the system, right? So if we're talking about hunger, that would be the number of people or the percentage of people in the community that are suffering from hunger. That's a result. That's one way that you can think of results of how the system is currently working to produce that actual result. So a lot of, um, if you want to do your research, or when you do your research on the results, the stats can tell you a lot about how the system is currently working. Okay. So here are a few tips when you're doing your 5R analysis. So again, you need to research the problem, which is why the problem tree, that exercise is really important because you want to have a good understanding of the problem from a very objective place. Many times, excuse me, we see the problem, we can sort of see the problem very clearly in the outcomes that are being produced. But researching the problem can help us understand why perhaps these outcomes are being produced in the way that they're being produced, right? So we have to do our research. Next, we want to clearly define the problem. I'm sorry, the system. Clearly define the system. This is very important because as you know, when I used a very simple illustration of us as human beings being a part of being both a part of larger systems, but also being, having, we have even within us subsystems that work, right, to produce, everything we produce in the world. How we show up in the world is a result of multiple systems that work together. Our blood system, our nervous system, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're attempting to do a 5R analysis, try to be very clear on what the system is, right? You don't want to just try to, so for instance, let's talk about education. You could talk about education as a national system in your countries, or you can narrow down the system to a subsystem, which would be the school in your community, right? Or let's even say you can narrow it down to your local school system, and then you can narrow it down even further to an actual school. Even that standalone school is a system. It's a part, again, of a broader system, but it's a system within itself. Now, when I coach entrepreneurs through the 5Rs analysis, I try to help them really clearly define the system in a way that's very practical for them, right? So it may be practical for some organizations to address an educational system at the national level. For some, it may be practical for them to address it at the local level. And for some, it may be most practical for them just to address one school, right? So what's really important here is that you have a very clear definition of your system and make it very practical. Which takes me to my next tip. Try as much as possible to institutionalize your system, right? So using the school as an example, when you institutionalize a system, I'm gonna go back one slide. It makes it easier for you to identify the resources, the rules, the roles, the relationships, and even the results. Why? Because most institutions have very clear policies that are written, right? Institutions have very clear roles that are usually written. So as much as possible, try to define the border of your system, which takes me to my next tip. Try to create those borders around institutions. So I used, even at the national level, that's an institutionalized system, right? Because at a national level, you have policies, laws that impact how the national educational system would work, for example, right? But even at the local level, or even at the school level, when you're talking about one individual school, using education as an example again, there are very specific rules and roles, et cetera, that define that system, right? What's really important here is that you try to define your system as much as possible within institutional borders, and that's a good place to start to create borders around your system, right? Borders meaning like be very clearly defined of where the system ends, right? We know with a school on a local level that there are very clear borders around that school that differentiates that system maybe from the national education system, for instance, right? So that's what that speaks to. Lastly, you want to be relevant, right? Make sure that your system is relevant to the work that you do, right? So if you are based in Nigeria, for instance, and you're working on educational reform, then you don't necessarily want to look at Europe or the US educational system as the system that you want to change. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, but it just speaks to being very specific and relevant to your work, to your location, to your context about the system that you want to address, right? That was a silly example that I used, but I think it illustrates the point. You don't want to focus on something that's not relevant to your context, and even relevant to your abilities as an organization, right? If you're working, again, using education as an example, if you're working with teachers, for instance, if you want to change somehow the way teachers, that role interacts with the system, then you don't want to then try to focus on some other part of the system, let's say like building maintenance for schools, right? That's outside of the scope or relevance of your work. Your focus is on teachers. So, I mean, those may seem like silly examples, but it's important to note that you really want to make sure that your analysis and the system that you choose to focus on is very relevant to your work. Okay. All right. So I am going to get into an example. After the example, we'll do Q&A. So yeah, we'll get right into it. We will use Raj Javadev, who's an Ashoka Fellow, and his organization is the AC Justice Project. So I'm going to explain next the problem he's seeking to solve, the system, and then I'm going to just give you a little bit of a taste of the work that he does, and then we'll go through the 5R, and we'll sort of look at the system, identify the 5Rs, and then we'll really state how his organization actually has intervened to change the system and what that looks like. Okay, so in the U.S., I'm saying that because I'm based in the U.S. We have 21% of the world's prisoners population, despite the fact that we only have 5% of the world's population. So, in our criminal justice system, there are severe racial, and I should also say class disparities, right? So this is the big problem. So in looking at that problem, we're talking about a very large and complex system, right? And so let's look at the system that the AC project seeks to change. This is the US criminal defense system. So in the criminal defense system, you have public defenders who are overworked, under-resourced, and often not well equipped to effectively represent the huge caseloads they manage. And the accused often don't have the means to get better support, okay? So we've looked at the problem, which talks about the US criminal justice system at a very high level, and this problem with us have basically incarcerating way too many people. Way too many people in the US are incarcerated, right? And so the system that we're looking at is the US criminal defense system. So that's just one part of a much larger system, right? So we're getting more and more and more focused. Now, in regards to the AC project, they're not only focused on the US criminal defense system, but in the illustration that we're going to use, we're going to look at the US criminal defense system in one jurisdiction, which is San Francisco, okay? So we went from this big, huge problem. We've narrowed down this problem to focus on one part of the system. And then taking it even further, we're going to focus on just one jurisdiction, which is San Francisco. Now, the AC Justice Project, basically what they do in this model is that they have created a way for friends and families to become extensions of the defense system. And I'll explain, and when we do our 5R analysis, you'll see how that works. But right now, I'm just going to give you a very general description of what they do. Let me explain it again. They provide the friends and families of those accused of crimes or those who are in the system. They use those friends and families and create an extension of support for the public defenders. So what these friends and family, what they do is that they do research for the public defenders. Remember, the public defenders are overworked, under-resourced. So they help do research, among other things. And they also provide insight to judges and juries on the character of the accused. Okay, so that's what the AC Justice Project does. So we have the problem, we have the system, and we have the solution. Now, let's take a step back and let's just look at this US criminal justice system. Again, we're talking about one jurisdiction, and I want to give you an idea of how the system was working before the intervention. So remember, and this is very important to remember, when you do your 5R analysis, you're not inserting your organization into the analysis, right? You are like God, and you're taking a step back and you're looking at it from the outside, right? You're like God in the sense that you can create interventions, but you're not actually injecting yourself in the system at this point, right? You're just taking a look and doing a canvas of the system as if you're someone on the outside. Imagine, again, I'm using the example of God. You're on the outside looking at the world as an outsider, for instance. And that's just an example. I don't know what your religion is. I'm just using that as an example, okay? All right, so you're taking a look at the system. Now let's look at how the US criminal justice system works. And we're using San Francisco as an example. So some of the resources that influence the system, again, are court buildings, right? Of course. The money, which is through taxpayer dollars in the US system, that's where the money comes from. But there's money that's involved to support the role of public defender, right? Then you have something that's a little bit more cultural. Again, it's not as explicit. And this is the goodwill of the supporting community. So everyone that goes through the criminal justice system has friends and family, not everyone, I should say, but most people have friends or families or loved ones outside the system that supports them, that wants the best for them. right? That's also a resource, but it's not something that is very explicit. It's more cultural. It's more. It's something that is a little bit more implicit, right? And that's why thinking of culture becomes very important. Now, rules. Of course, you have the code of law. You have laws. That's pretty obvious. Um, there are also rules about compensation for public defenders, right? So you have the money is the actual resource, but then there are actual rules that dictate how much a public defender can make, right? And then again, you have court proceedings, right? There are rules around how courts actually function, right? There are very explicit rules that you can probably Google and find, you know, there's nothing you have to really make up here, right? We're just using these as categories, but all of these things can be researched, right? Roles. In any criminal justice system, you have a judge or judges, right? You have juries, you have the accused, and then you have the community. So now the first three roles are very institutional. You can do your research and find out how the roles, the specific role that a judge may play. Um, the accused, of course, they play a specific role, right? And again, going back, there are rules that govern these roles in most instances. And then you have the community. So they play less of a formal role within the system, but they definitely play a role, right? Just, they show up to court hearings, for instance, right? They play a role, oftentimes is community members that may fund, let's say if it's a community member that may provide, in the US, those who are incarcerated, you can actually provide money to them so that they can purchase things within the system, right? That's a community role. That illustration is a little bit more formal, but the community definitely plays a role in this system. Relationships. Again, relationships are often dictated by the previous three R's: the resources, the rules, and the roles. So you have a defense attorney. Sorry, there's a typo there. You have a defense attorney that represents the accused, right? That's a specific role that the defense attorney plays, right? Oh, sorry, that's a relationship. Sorry, let me restate that. The defense attorney represents the accused. That's the relationship that the defense attorney has with the accused. So it's very formal. They're representing the accused, and that's how that relationship works, right? Of course, that's based on the roles. The jury determines the guilt of the accused. That speaks both to their role, but also to their relationship to the accused, right? So you see here, there's oftentimes a thin line between roles and relationships within institutions, within formalized systems, right? The judge decides the sentence of the accused. So the question that is to be asked there is, how does that impact the relationship? Of course, it's hierarchical, right? The accused would not fare well if they were disrespectful to the judge, because of the type of role that the judge plays. It dictates the relationship that the judge has with the accused, right? As well as with the defense attorney, etc. And then the community supports the accused, right? That's the relationship that they have. They don't play as much of an official role within the system, but their relation, the way their but their role actually dictates how the relationship dynamics within the system. So they're there for support. They show up to the court hearings. They may provide additional resources for their defense, right, or even for their comfort while they're incarcerated. they play a certain relationship, a supporting relationship, is the role that they play with the accused. So again, there's sort of an overlap between, oftentimes between roles and relationships, right? So these things aren't necessarily 100% separate, but they sort of, these are systems, right? So they play, they interact with each other. Now, lastly, we have results. So the results that you can think about within the US criminal justice system are the percentage of those who are convicted, right? The conviction rate, right? You could think of that as one of the results that you could use to analyze this system. Now, we're not being specific here, but we're just using this as an example. When you really do this exercise, again, you're going to do your research and you're going to have real statistics. Another result would be like the length and term of the sentence. Another result would be inequity for low income and people of color. So those are Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people, etc. Right? So again, I'm going to step back again and put this into the right context for you. This is a tool to analyze systems. There are 5 components to every system, and these components you're going to research when you do this exercise, but you're only going to research the parts of the system that are relevant to your work and relevant to how you've defined the system, right? And then this would just give you an understanding of how the system currently works. This has nothing to do with your organization, at least not for the sake of exercise, right? The purpose of the exercise is not for you necessarily to understand how you're already a part of the system, but it's just for you to understand how the system works, right? Now, you may be wondering, why do I have these highlighted in red? That's a great question. And that will bring us to our next slide. So to answer that question, this is highlighted in red because this is where the AC Justice Project, this is where they saw their opportunities, right? They did a mapping of the system, right? They found that under resources, these are the things that stuck out to them as areas where they could possibly influence the system. Okay, so now let's look at the AC Justice Project. Now that they've done their analysis, this is how they have used this analysis to change the system. So again, the system they identified is a criminal justice system, right? They saw that there was a major role that could be played by the community of those who are accused. So they changed the relationship by formalizing the relationship of the community with the court to not only help make the case for the accused, but also to help support public defenders, right? The impact is that 1,862 years of time saved. So what that means is that the number of years that people were serving in the system was reduced by 1,862 years because of the intervention of the work of the AC Justice Project. Now, again, you all would get this slide, which will have links to the actual program so you can see more of how that works. They have a very robust impact and measurement strategy, which we will talk about in our later webinars. But they were able to measure their impact by the number of years saved, which of course going back to the original problem. They're saving, if there are so many people incarcerated, they're actually reducing the number of people incarcerated because there is time saved on their sentences, right? So they're still speaking to this big problem, but at a very local level. This speaks to their impact in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that's San Francisco, California, Oakland, and some of the other surrounding communities. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we are going to do Q&A. I hope that that presentation made sense. And the way we're going to do this is that you can raise your hand in the chat and then we'll answer any questions that you may have. If for our Francophone participants, please put your question in the chat, and I want to ask Chalanju to help manage that and interpret your questions.